The first light of dawn crept slowly through the olive trees, casting long shadows across the peaceful garden. Epicurus opened his eyes and felt the familiar warmth of the morning sun on his weathered face. At 71 years old, his body was tired and full of pain, but his mind remained as clear as the mountain spring that flowed through his beloved sanctuary. He had built this garden 36 years ago, not just as a place to grow vegetables and flowers, but as a home for people who wanted to learn how to live well. The garden was different from other schools in Athens. Here, women learned alongside men. Former slaves sat next to wealthy citizens. Everyone was welcome if they truly wanted to understand the secrets of a happy life. Epicurus slowly sat up on his simple wooden bed. Through the window, he could see Hermarchus already walking among the fruit trees, checking on the morning harvest. His faithful student had been with him for 20 years now. Soon, very soon, Hermarchus would have to lead the garden alone. The old philosopher knew his time was ending. The pain in his stomach had grown worse each day, and the fever that came and went told him that death was approaching. But Epicurus felt no fear. This surprised many people who knew him. Most men his age spent their final days worrying about what would happen after death. They made offerings to gods they hoped would be kind to them. They feared punishment for their mistakes. They wondered if their souls would wander lost in some dark place forever. Not Epicurus. He had spent his entire life teaching people that death was nothing to be afraid of. Now, as his own death drew near, he would prove that his teachings were not just clever words, but real wisdom that could give peace, even in the final moments of life. He stood slowly and walked to the small table where he kept his writing materials. Every morning for decades, he had written letters to friends in distant cities, sharing his thoughts about how to live without fear and worry. Today would be no different. Even on his last day, he would continue to help others find peace. As he dipped his pen in ink, he remembered a conversation from the day before. A young woman named Chloe had come to the garden in tears. She was only 25 years old, but she could not sleep at night because she was so afraid of dying. She had heard rumors that the gods were angry with Athens. She worried that disease or war might take her life before she had really lived. Epicurus had sat with her under the fig tree and spoken gently. "My dear Chloe," he had said, "you are suffering from an illness that affects almost everyone. You are afraid of something that cannot hurt you. Death is simply the absence of feeling. When you are alive, death is not there. When death comes, you are no longer there to experience it. So when exactly does death cause you pain?" The young woman had looked confused. "But what about after death? What if the gods punish me? What if my soul suffers forever?" Epicurus had smiled. "The gods are perfectly happy. They have no need to punish anyone. They do not interfere in human affairs any more than the sun needs to worry about the problems of ants. And as for your soul, it is made of the same tiny particles as everything else in the world. When your body dies, these particles simply separate and return to nature. There is no you left to suffer." At first, Chloe had found this idea frightening. If there was nothing after death, what was the point of being good? What was the point of anything? But Epicurus had helped her understand, because there is no eternal punishment to fear and no eternal reward to earn. You are free to focus on what really matters. You can choose to be kind because kindness makes life pleasant for everyone around you. You can choose to learn and grow because learning brings joy. You can choose to form deep friendships because friendship is the greatest pleasure life offers. By the time Chloe left the garden, she was no longer crying. She still felt sad about the idea of death, but the terrible fear was gone. She promised to return and learn more about living without anxiety. This was why Epicurus had devoted his life to teaching. In his time, people lived with constant worry. The great city-states of Greece were no longer powerful. Foreign armies marched back and forth across the land. Old traditions were disappearing. The gods that people had worshipped for centuries seemed distant and uncaring. Many people felt lost and frightened. They did not know how to find happiness in such an uncertain world. Some turned to wine and wild parties, thinking that loud pleasures would drown out their fears. Others became harsh and bitter, deciding that life was meaningless and cruel. Epicurus had found a different way. He taught that happiness was not found in exciting adventures or expensive things. Real happiness came from simple pleasures that were available to everyone. The taste of fresh bread, the warmth of friendship, the beauty of a sunset, the satisfaction of understanding a difficult idea. Most importantly, he taught that happiness came from being free of two great fears that tormented most people: the fear of the gods and the fear of death. When people stopped being afraid of these things, they could finally relax and enjoy the good things that life offered every day. As Epicurus finished writing his morning letter, he heard footsteps approaching his room. Leontian entered quietly, carrying a bowl of warm porridge and a cup of watered wine. She had been part of the garden for 15 years, and her presence always brought him comfort. "Good morning, teacher," she said softly. "How are you feeling today?" "My body is tired, my dear friend, but my mind is at peace," Epicurus replied. "I have been thinking about how strange it is that most people spend their lives running away from death, when death is the most natural thing in the world. A flower blooms, brings beauty to the world, and then returns to the earth. No one expects the flower to bloom forever." Leontian sat down beside him. "Will you teach us more about this today?" "Some of the newer students are still struggling with fear." Epicurus nodded. "Of course. Every day we have left is a chance to help someone find peace. That is the most important work anyone can do." As the morning sun climbed higher, more members of the garden began to wake. Soon they would gather for their daily discussion, and Epicurus would share his wisdom one more time. He did not know that this would be his final lesson, but he was ready. He'd lived well, and he would die well, showing everyone that philosophy was not just about thinking, but about finding real peace in a troubled world. As the morning grew warmer, Epicurus walked slowly through his garden with Hermarchus at his side. The younger man had been asking about the early days, when the garden was just an idea in his teacher's mind. Epicurus paused near the well where they drew their water and began to remember. "When I was your age, Hermarchus, the world was a very different place," the old philosopher said, his voice growing distant. Athens was still recovering from terrible wars and disasters. The city that had once ruled the seas was now just another small player in a much larger and more dangerous game. Hermarchus had heard bits of this story before, but he always wanted to know more. "Tell me about those days, teacher. Help me understand why your philosophy was so needed." Epicurus sat down on a stone bench, feeling the weight of his years. "I was born just as the old world was ending. Alexander the Great had conquered everything from Egypt to India, but when he died, his empire fell apart like a broken pot. His generals became kings and started fighting each other for power. Greece became a battlefield." The old man's eyes grew sad as he continued. "I remember being a young boy when the news came that Alexander was dead. My father was terrified. He knew that our peaceful life on the island of Samos would not last. He was right. Within a few years, we were forced to leave our home and flee to Athens." Marcus could barely imagine such upheaval. The garden had always been his world, a place of peace and learning. "What was Athens like when you arrived?" "Chaos," Epicurus said simply. The great democracy that had produced Socrates and Plato was dying. Foreign kings decided what happened in the city. Sometimes Athens was controlled by Macedonia, sometimes by Egypt, sometimes by Syria. The citizens never knew who would be in charge next month. He stood up and walked to a small statue of Athena that stood among the olive trees. People had lost faith in everything that had once made them proud. The old gods seemed powerless to protect the city. The great philosophers offered complicated theories that had nothing to do with daily life. Young men who should have been learning to be good citizens were instead learning to be soldiers in foreign armies. "Is that why you decided to become a teacher?" Hermarchus asked. Epicurus nodded. "I saw so much suffering that could have been avoided. People were afraid all the time. They worried about wars they could not prevent. They made offerings to gods who never answered their prayers. They sought pleasure in things that only made them more miserable." The philosopher began walking again, this time toward the vegetable garden where several students were working. "I remember one day in the marketplace, when I was about 30 years old, I saw a woman crying because her son had been forced to join the army of some king, whose name she could not even pronounce. She was convinced that the gods were angry with Athens, and that everyone would be punished." "What did you tell her?" Hermarchus asked. "I told her that the gods were not angry, because the gods do not concern themselves with human wars. I explained that her son's fate would be decided by human choices, not divine anger. And I promised her that there was a way to find peace, even in the middle of such troubled times." They reached the garden where 3 students were picking beans. Epicurus smiled as he watched them work. You see how calm they are? How focused on their simple task? This is what I wanted to create here. A place where people could learn to find happiness in small, real things instead of chasing after things they could not control. One of the students, a middle-aged man named Demetrius, looked up from his work. Teacher, I still find it hard to believe that you started this place when Athens was so dangerous. Were you not afraid? Epicurus laughed gently. Of course I was afraid sometimes, but I had learned something important. I had learned that most of our fears come from misunderstanding what we can and cannot control. He picked up a handful of soil and let it run through his fingers. When I was young, I wasted so much energy worrying about things that were completely beyond my power. I worried about whether Athens would regain its glory. I worried about whether the gods approved of my thoughts, worried about what would happen to my soul after death. When did you realize these worries were pointless? Demetrius asked. Gradually, Epicurus replied. I began to study the teachings of Democritus, who said that everything in the world is made of tiny particles that come together and separate according to natural laws. This helped me understand that there is no mysterious spiritual world causing problems in our physical world. He paused to help Demetrius with a particularly stubborn bean plant. Once I understood that the world operates according to natural laws, I realized that the gods do not interfere in human affairs. They exist, but they live in perfect happiness and have no reason to make trouble for us. Hermarchus was fascinated. So you stopped worrying about divine punishment exactly. And once I stopped fearing the gods, I could focus on the real question. How should human beings live in order to be happy? The group began walking back toward the main house. As they walked, Epicurus continued his story. I spent years traveling and teaching, but I always dreamed of creating a place where people could live according to philosophical principles, not just talk about them, but actually live them. Why did you choose to include women and slaves in your school? Asked Leontian, who had joined them. The other philosophers think this is very strange. Epicurus smiled. Because wisdom is not limited to free men. Some of the most insightful questions I have ever heard came from women and former slaves. They often understand suffering better than those who have always been comfortable. As they reached the shade of the large plane tree at the center of the garden, Epicurus sat down heavily. The walk had tired him more than usual. You must understand, all of you, that this garden exists because the world outside is often harsh and confusing. People need a place where they can learn to live without constant fear and anxiety. But teacher, Hermarchus said, the world is still harsh and confusing. Kings still fight wars. People still suffer and die. True, Epicurus agreed. But here, we have learned not to add unnecessary suffering to the pain that life naturally brings. We have learned to find joy in friendship, in simple pleasures, in the pursuit of wisdom. We have learned that happiness is possible even in an imperfect world. As the afternoon heat grew stronger, the students began to disperse to their various tasks. Epicurus remained under the tree, thinking about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. The world had not become safer or more predictable since his youth. If anything, it had become more complicated. But here in the garden, he had proved that it was possible to create a small island of peace in a turbulent sea. Tomorrow, after he was gone, his students would continue this work. They would teach others that happiness did not depend on external circumstances, but on internal understanding. This was his gift to a troubled world, the knowledge that tranquility was always possible, those who knew where to look for it. Later that afternoon, Epicurus found himself sitting with a small group of his closest students under the shade of the old fig tree. The heat was making him drowsy, but Leontian had asked him to tell them more about his early life. She believed that understanding their teacher's journey would help them carry on his work after he was gone. I was not born wise. Epicurus began with a gentle smile. When I was a child on the island of Samos, I was as confused and frightened as any other boy. My parents were Athenian colonists who had moved to the island to start a new life. They worked hard to build a small farm and raise their family. He paused to sip some water, then continued. I remember the day everything changed for me. I was 14 years old, and our neighbor came running to tell us that a ship had arrived with terrible news. Alexander the Great was dead, and the empire was falling apart. Within days, soldiers would come to take our land and give it back to the original inhabitants of Samos. Young Marcus, who had only joined the garden a few months earlier, looked puzzled. But teacher, surely your family could have fought to keep your home. Epicurus shook his head. My boy, we were just ordinary people caught up in the games of kings and generals. We had no power to change what was happening. All we could do was pack what we could carry and flee to Athens like thousands of other refugees. That must have been terrifying, Lanchin said softly. It was. Epicurus agreed. But it also taught me something important. I learned that most of the things we worry about are completely beyond our control. We cannot stop kings from fighting wars, cannot prevent earthquakes or plagues. We cannot even control what other people think about us. He stood up slowly and walked to the edge of the garden where he could see the walls of Athens in the distance. When we arrived in Athens, my family had almost nothing. We lived in a tiny room and survived on whatever work my father could find. I saw my parents grow old before their time, worn down by worry and hardship. Is that when you decided to become a philosopher? Marcus asked. Not exactly, Epicurus replied. At first I wanted to be a politician. I thought that if I could gain power, I could protect my family and make life better for everyone. But I soon realized that political power was just another illusion. The real rulers of Athens were foreign kings who lived far away. Local politicians were just their servants. He returned to his seat and looked at each of his students. I was 18 when I first heard about the ideas of Democritus. One of my teachers mentioned that this old philosopher had claimed that everything in the world was made of tiny, invisible particles. Most people laughed at this idea, but it fascinated me. Why? Leontian asked. Because if Democritus was right, then everything that happened in the world could be explained by natural laws. There would be no need for angry gods or mysterious spirits. The universe would make sense. Epicurus closed his eyes and seemed to drift back in time. I spent months studying everything I could find about Democritus and his teacher, Leucippus. They taught that these tiny particles, which they called atoms, were constantly moving and combining in different ways. Sometimes they formed rocks, sometimes plants, sometimes animals, sometimes human beings. But what about the soul? Marcus asked. What about the part of us that thinks and feels? That was the most important discovery of all, Epicurus said, his voice growing stronger. If human beings are made of the same atoms as everything else, then our souls are not magical or immortal. They are simply arrangements of particles that will eventually separate and return to the natural world. I opened his eyes and looked directly at Marcus. This means that when we die, there is no ghost left behind to be punished or rewarded. There is no eternal suffering to fear and no eternal paradise to earn. We are simply part of the great natural process that governs all life. Marcus, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. But teacher, did this idea not make you feel sad or empty? There is nothing after death? What is the point of being good? Epicurus laughed, a sound full of genuine joy. My dear friend, it had exactly the opposite effect. Once I understood that there was no supernatural world to worry about, I could focus completely on this world. I could ask the most important question of all. How should we live in order to be truly happy? He gestured toward the garden around them. I began to experiment with different ways of living. I tried the path of wild pleasure, thinking that if life was short, I should enjoy as much as possible. I spent months drinking wine, eating expensive food, and seeking out every kind of entertainment Athens had to offer. What happened? Leontian asked. I made myself miserable, Epicurus admitted. I discovered that intense pleasures always come with intense pains. Too much wine gave me terrible headaches. Too much rich food made me sick. Too much excitement left me exhausted and empty. He picked up a simple piece of bread from the table beside him and held it up. So I began to experiment with simple pleasures. I found that a piece of fresh bread tasted better when I was truly hungry than the finest delicacies did when I was already full. I discovered that a conversation with a good friend was more satisfying than any entertainment. Is that when you decided to start teaching? Marcus asked. I started teaching because I could not keep this knowledge to myself. Epicurus replied, I saw so many people around me living in unnecessary fear and chasing after things that would never make them happy. I wanted to share what I had learned. He stood up again and began walking slowly around the group. At first, I taught in the traditional way. I would stand in the marketplace and give speeches about philosophy, but I quickly realized that this was not enough. People needed to see these ideas in action, not just hear about them. So you created the garden? Marcus said. Yes, but it took many years to save enough money to buy this land. During those years, I kept teaching and learning. I attracted a group of students who wanted to live according to these principles. We moved from place to place, always looking for a permanent home. Epicurus sat back down, looking tired but content. The most important thing I learned during those wandering years was that philosophy is not about clever arguments or complex theories. It is about finding practical ways to live without fear and anxiety. "What made you decide to include women and slaves in your school?" Leontian asked. "Because I realized that wisdom has nothing to do with social status," Epicurus replied. "Some of the deepest insights I have ever heard came from people that other philosophers ignored." A former slave who had experienced real suffering often understood happiness better than a wealthy citizen who had never known hardship. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Epicurus looked at his students with deep affection. "You must understand that everything I have taught you grew out of my own struggles and discoveries. I was not born with special knowledge, simply refused to accept that life had to be filled with fear and misery. And now," Marcus asked quietly, "now I can face death with the same curiosity and courage that I once brought to the questions of life," Epicurus replied. "I have lived fully, loved deeply, and shared what I learned with others. What more could any person ask for?" As darkness fell over the garden, the students helped their aging teacher back to his room. They knew that his story was nearing its end. But they also knew that his teachings would live on through their own lives and the lives of those they would teach in turn. The next morning, Epicurus woke before dawn and made his way to the small herb garden behind his house. Despite the pain in his body, he felt a strange sense of urgency. He wanted to spend his remaining time sharing the most important lessons he had learned. As he knelt among the medicinal plants, he thought about the simple truths that had guided his life for so many years. When Hermarchus found him there an hour later, Epicurus was carefully picking mint leaves and placing them in a small basket. "Teacher," Hermarchus said gently, "you should be resting." "Let me gather the herbs for you, my dear friend," Epicurus replied without looking up. "I have been thinking about medicine all morning. Not the kind that heals the body, but the kind that heals the soul. I want to share with you and the others what I call the fourfold medicine." Hermarchus sat down beside his teacher in the soft earth. "Tell me about this medicine." Epicurus held up 4 different herbs from his basket. "Just as these plants can cure different kinds of physical pain, there are 4 simple truths that can cure the suffering of the human heart. I have taught these ideas for years, but today I want to make sure you understand them completely." By this time, several other students had noticed their teacher in the garden and came to join the conversation. Leontian, Marcus, and 3 newer students sat in a circle around Epicurus as he began to speak. "The first medicine," Epicurus said, holding up a sprig of lavender, "is this. God is not to be feared." He paused to let this sink in. "I do not mean that gods do not exist. They do exist, but they live in perfect happiness and have no reason to interfere in human affairs." A young student named Alexios raised his hand. "But teacher, if the gods do not care about us, how do we explain earthquakes and plagues? Surely these are punishments for our wrongdoing." Epicurus smiled patiently. "My boy, think about it this way. The gods are perfectly content. They have everything they need and want nothing more. Why would such beings concern themselves with whether humans follow certain rules or perform certain rituals? That would be like asking the sun to worry about whether ants approve of its light." He picked up a handful of soil and let it run through his fingers. "Natural disasters happen because of natural causes. The earth shakes because of forces deep underground. Disease spreads because of tiny particles we cannot see. These things are not messages from angry gods. They're simply part of how the world works. But if the gods do not reward good behavior or punish bad behavior, why should we try to be good?" Alexios asked. "Because being good makes life better for everyone," Epicurus replied. "When you are kind to others, they are more likely to be kind to you. When you are honest in your dealings, people trust you. When you help your neighbors, you build a community where everyone feels safe and cared for." He held up the second herb, a small branch of rosemary. "The second medicine is this. Death is not to be feared." Several students shifted uncomfortably. This was always the hardest teaching for people to accept. "I know this seems impossible," Epicurus continued, "but think carefully about what death actually is. Death is simply the absence of sensation. When you are alive, you can feel pleasure and pain. When you are dead, you feel nothing at all." Leontian spoke up. Teacher, I understand that death itself cannot hurt us. But what about the process of dying? What about the pain and fear that come before death? That is a different question, Epicurus acknowledged. The pain of dying is real, just like any other pain. But most of our suffering about death comes from imagining terrible things that will happen after we die. Once we understand that there is no after, we can face death with much less fear. He looked around at the worried faces of his students. Let me give you an example. Imagine that you are about to take a long journey to a place you have never seen. You might worry about what will happen there. Will the people be friendly? Will there be enough food? Will you be safe? But if I told you that this journey would end in peaceful, dreamless sleep, would you still be afraid? I think I would find that comforting, Marcus said slowly. Exactly, Epicurus replied. Death is not a journey to an unknown place. It is simply the end of the journey. There is no mysterious destination where you might suffer. There is only the gentle ending of all sensation. He held up the third herb, a sprig of thyme. The third medicine is this: the good is attainable. He saw some students look skeptical. I do not mean that life is easy or that you can have everything you want. I mean that real happiness, real satisfaction, is within reach of every person. How can that be true? Asked a student named Callisto. Some people are rich and others are poor. Some are healthy and others are sick. Some are free and others are slaves. How can happiness be equally available to all? Epicurus began to walk slowly around the circle of students. Because true happiness does not depend on external circumstances. It depends on understanding what you actually need to live well. He stopped and pointed to the simple breakfast that Lianchan had brought out to the garden. Look at this meal: bread, olives, cheese, water. Is this not enough to satisfy hunger? Is this not enough to give pleasure to someone who is truly hungry? Yes, Callisto admitted, but surely a rich man's feast would bring more pleasure. Perhaps, Epicurus said, but not much more, and not for long. The rich man who eats elaborate meals every day soon becomes bored with them. But the person who appreciates simple food finds genuine pleasure in every meal. He sat back down and held up the fourth herb, a small piece of mint. The fourth medicine is this: the bad is endurable. He saw fear in some faces and quickly continued, I do not mean that suffering is good or that we should seek it out. I mean that even when bad things happen, they do not last forever, and they are not as terrible as we imagine them to be. But teacher, Marcus said, what about really terrible pain? What about losing someone we love? About being tortured or imprisoned? Epicurus was quiet for a moment. These are real sufferings, and I do not make light of them. But notice that most of our pain comes not from what is actually happening to us, but from our thoughts about what is happening. We suffer because we tell ourselves stories about how terrible things are and how much worse they might become. He held up his hand, which was trembling slightly from his illness. Right now my body is failing. I am in pain every day. I do not add to this pain by imagining that I am being punished or by wishing desperately that things were different. I accept what is happening and focus on what I can still enjoy. And what can you still enjoy? Lianchan asked softly. This conversation, Epicurus replied immediately. The warmth of the sun on my face, the taste of fresh water when I am thirsty, the sound of your voices, the knowledge that I have lived a good life and helped others find peace. He gathered all four herbs together in his hands. These four medicines can cure almost any kind of spiritual suffering. When you are afraid, remember that the gods are not angry with you and that death cannot hurt you. When you are unhappy, remember that simple pleasures are always available and that even pain will pass. As the morning sun climbed higher, the students began to understand that their teacher was giving them something precious. Not just ideas to think about, but practical tools they could use every day for the rest of their lives. Will you teach us more about how to use these medicines? Marcus asked. Epicurus smiled and began to stand up, leaning heavily on his student's arm. Of course. We have the whole day ahead of us, and there is still so much to share. As they walked back toward the house together, each student carried one of the herbs their teacher had given them. They knew that these simple plants would always remind them of the four truths that could bring peace to any troubled heart. That afternoon, Epicurus decided to take his students on a slow walk around the entire garden. Despite his failing health, he wanted to show them how every part of their home demonstrated the deeper truths he had spent his life discovering. The sun was warm but not harsh, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the air. "Come," he said to the small group gathered around him. "Let me show you the real meaning of pleasure." They began their walk near the vegetable garden, where tomatoes hung heavy on their vines and beans climbed wooden poles toward the sky. Epicurus stopped and picked a ripe tomato, holding it up to catch the light. "Tell me, Marcus," he said to the young student, "what do you see here?" "Tomato, teacher," Marcus replied, looking puzzled. "Look more carefully," Epicurus encouraged. "What you are seeing is thousands of tiny particles that have come together in just the right way to create this perfect fruit. The same atoms that were once part of the soil, the rain, and the sunshine have arranged themselves to give us something beautiful and nourishing." He handed the tomato to Marcus, who took a small bite. "The sweetness you taste, the juice that refreshes you, the nutrients that will strengthen your body. All of this comes from the natural world reorganizing itself. There is no magic here, only the wonderful complexity of nature." Leontien, who was walking beside them, smiled. "I remember when I first came to the garden. I thought your teachings about atoms were just interesting ideas. Now I see them everywhere." "That is exactly right," Epicurus said as they continued walking. "Once you understand that everything is made of the same basic particles, you begin to see the connections between all things. You realize that you are not separate from nature, but part of it." They passed by a small pond where several ducks were swimming lazily in the afternoon heat. Marcus pointed to them and asked, "Teacher, do the ducks understand pleasure the way we do?" Epicurus sat down on a bench beside the pond and watched the ducks for a moment. "They understand it better than we do," he replied. "Look how content they are with simple things. They enjoy the cool water, the warmth of the sun, the taste of the plants they find in the pond. They do not worry about whether they deserve these pleasures or whether they will last forever." "But surely human pleasure is different from animal pleasure," suggested Callisto, another student. "We can think and appreciate beauty in ways that animals cannot." "You are absolutely correct," Epicurus agreed. "Humans have the capacity for two kinds of pleasure. The first kind is what I call moving pleasure, the active enjoyment of food, drink, physical comfort, and sensual experiences. This is the kind of pleasure we share with the ducks." He gestured toward the peaceful scene around them. "But we also have access to a higher kind of pleasure, the static pleasure of a mind at rest. This is the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding, from friendship, from the absence of anxiety and fear." A new student named Helen, who had arrived at the garden just a few weeks earlier, looked confused. "I do not understand the difference, teacher. Can you explain it more simply?" Epicurus smiled gently. "Of course, my dear. Moving pleasure is like the joy you feel when you taste honey or feel warm water on your skin. It is wonderful, but it does not last very long. Static pleasure is like the contentment you feel when you are sitting with good friends, with no worries troubling your mind. It can last for hours or even days." They stood up and continued their walk, passing through a grove of olive trees that provided cool shade. "Most people," Epicurus continued, "chase after moving pleasures and wonder why they are never satisfied. They eat until they are sick, drink until they have headaches, seek excitement until they are exhausted. But here in the garden," Helen observed, "people seem happy with very simple things." "Because we have learned to appreciate both kinds of pleasure in their proper measure," Epicurus explained. "We enjoy good food when we are hungry, but we do not make eating the purpose of our lives. We enjoy the beauty of music and art, but we do not depend on constant entertainment to feel alive." They reached a small clearing where several students were sitting in a circle, engaged in quiet conversation. Epicurus stopped to listen for a moment, then smiled broadly. "And there," he said, "you see the highest pleasure of all, the pleasure of friendship." "Why do you value friendship so highly, teacher?" asked Marcus. "Surely wisdom or virtue are more important." Epicurus sat down on a fallen log and motioned for his students to join him. "Because friendship contains all the other pleasures within it. When you have true friends, you have people who will share your joys and comfort you in your sorrows. You have companions for learning and discovery. You have others who will help you become the best version of yourself." He looked at each of their faces with obvious affection. "More than that, when you love others and know that you are loved in return, you lose the terrible loneliness that drives so much human suffering. You realize that you are not a single, isolated atom struggling alone in an uncaring universe. You are part of a community, connected to others by bonds of care and understanding. Lianshan nodded thoughtfully. I think I understand now why you welcomed women and slaves into the garden. You saw that the capacity for friendship has nothing to do with social status. Exactly, Epicurus replied. Some of the deepest friendships I have known have been with people that the rest of Athens considers unimportant. Wisdom and kindness can be found in any human heart, regardless of whether that person was born free or enslaved, male or female, rich or poor. They walked on until they reached the farthest corner of the garden, where a small workshop housed the tools and materials the community used for their daily work. Epicurus picked up a simple wooden bowl that one of the students had carved. This bowl, he said, represents everything I have tried to teach you about living well. It is beautiful but not fancy, useful but not complicated. It was made with care and attention but without anxiety or stress. It will serve its purpose for many years, bringing simple pleasure to whoever uses it. He handed the bowl to Helen. This is how I want you to think about your own lives. Not as grand adventures full of drama and excitement, but as works of craft that you shape with patience and wisdom. Each day, you can add something beautiful and useful to the person you are becoming. As they began the walk back toward the main house, the sun was starting to sink lower in the sky. The garden was filled with the soft sounds of evening, birds calling to each other. The gentle splash of water in the fountain, the quiet murmur of conversations. Teacher, Hermarchus said as they walked, I am beginning to understand why you created this place. It is not just a school where people come to learn ideas. It is a place where people come to learn how to live. And more than that, Epicurus replied, it is a place where people discover that the good life is not something rare and difficult to achieve. It is available to anyone who understands what they really need and how to find it. They paused at the entrance to the house, and Epicurus looked back over the garden one more time. In the gathering dusk, it looked peaceful and timeless. A small, perfect world where human beings had learned to live in harmony with each other and with nature. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I may not be able to take such a long walk. But the garden will remain, and all of you will carry its lessons with you wherever you go. You will remember that pleasure is not the enemy of wisdom, but its natural companion. You will remember that happiness grows best in the soil of friendship. And you will remember that the secret of the good life is hidden in plain sight, waiting for anyone who has eyes to see it. As they went inside for their evening meal, each student felt that they had received a precious gift. Not just knowledge about philosophy, but a new way of seeing the world around them. That evening, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Epicurus felt the pain in his body growing stronger. He had been hiding the worst of it from his students, but now he could no longer pretend that death was not approaching quickly. He called Hermarchus to his room and spoke quietly. My dear friend, I think tonight may be my last night with clear thoughts. Tomorrow, the pain may be too great for teaching. I want to spend these final hours helping our students understand the most important lesson of all. Hermarchus felt tears forming in his eyes, but he tried to stay calm. What would you like me to do, teacher? Gather everyone in the main room. Tell them that I want to speak with them about death. Not as an idea to discuss, but as a reality we are facing together right now. Within an hour, all the members of the garden had assembled. Some sat on simple wooden chairs, others on cushions on the floor. The room was lit by oil lamps that cast a warm, gentle light on their faces. Epicurus entered slowly, supported by Hermarchus, and took his place in the center of the group. My friends, he began, his voice weaker than usual but still clear. Death is coming for me very soon. I can feel it in my bones and in my breath. This frightens some of you, I know. But I want to use this opportunity to show you that everything I have taught about death is true. A young student named Philippa began to cry softly. Teacher, I am so afraid, not just of losing you, but of my own death someday. How can you be so calm? Epicurus looked at her with infinite kindness. My dear child, your fear is natural and human. Every living thing has an instinct to survive. But most of our terror about death comes from misunderstanding what it actually is. He paused to catch his breath, then continued. Right now, in this moment, where is death? Can you see it in this room? Can you touch it or smell it? The students looked around, confused. No, teacher, Philippa replied. Death is not here now exactly. Death is not here because I am still alive. As long as I exist, death does not exist for me. And when death finally comes, I will no longer exist to experience it. So tell me, when exactly does death cause me suffering? Marcus raised his hand tentatively. But teacher, what about the pain you are feeling now? Is that not a kind of death? That is an excellent question, Epicurus replied. The pain I feel is real, and it is unpleasant. But the pain is not death. The pain is part of life. Even healthy people experience pain sometimes. The pain I feel now is simply more intense and more frequent than usual. He shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable, but his voice remained steady. The important thing is not to confuse the pain of dying with the imaginary suffering of being dead. I can deal with pain because pain is something that happens to living people. I have tools for managing pain. I can rest. I can take medicine. I can focus my mind on pleasant thoughts. Lianshin spoke up from her place near the window. Teacher, I think I understand what you mean about death not being able to hurt us, but I am still sad about losing you. Is it wrong to grieve? Not at all, Epicurus said with a warm smile. Grief is the natural response of a loving heart. You are not sad for me. You are sad for yourselves. You will miss our conversations. You will wish you could ask me questions. You will feel lonely without my presence. This sadness is real and appropriate. He leaned forward slightly, speaking more intensely. But do not let your grief convince you that I am suffering somewhere in some mysterious realm. When I die, the atoms that make up my body will separate and return to the natural world. Some will become part of the soil that feeds the plants in our garden. Some will become part of the air you breathe. A newer student named Theon, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. But teacher, if we are just collections of atoms that will eventually scatter, what makes life meaningful? Why does anything matter? Epicurus's eyes brightened at this question. Because meaning does not require permanence. Think about a beautiful song. The music only exists while it is being played, but that does not make it worthless. Think about a delicious meal. It only lasts while you are eating it, but that does not make it meaningless. He gestured around the room at all the faces looking back at him. This conversation we are having right now will end in an hour or two. Does that make it pointless? This friendship we share will not last forever in exactly this form. Does that make it false or empty? No, Theon admitted. I think I see what you mean. It's the temporary nature of something does not destroy its value. Precisely, Epicurus replied. In fact, the knowledge that life is limited makes it more precious, not less. If we lived forever, we might take everything for granted. Because our time is short, we can appreciate each moment more fully. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his strength. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Philippa, who had been crying earlier. Let me give you a practical exercise for dealing with fear of death. When you feel that terror rising in your chest, I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. First, what exactly am I afraid will happen to me after I die? Second, how do I know that this thing I fear is real? Third, what can I do right now while I am alive to make my life more meaningful and joyful? Can you show us how this works? Philippa asked. Of course, when I first became seriously ill, I noticed that I was afraid of several things. I was afraid that I would suffer eternal punishment for my mistakes. I was afraid that my consciousness would be trapped in some dark, lonely place. I was afraid that all my work and love would be forgotten and wasted. He paused and smiled gently. Then I examined each fear carefully. I asked myself where these ideas came from. I realized that my fear of punishment came from stories people told to control each other's behavior. My fear of being trapped came from confusing my conscious mind with some imaginary immortal soul. My fear of being forgotten came from wanting to control what happens after I am gone. And when you examined these fears, what did you discover? Marcus asked. I discovered that they were all based on false beliefs. There is no evidence for eternal punishment. There is no scientific reason to believe consciousness can exist without a functioning brain. And whether or not people remember me after I die has nothing to do with the value of the love and wisdom I have shared while alive. Epicurus looked around the room one more time, taking in each face. So now, when I feel afraid, I remind myself that fear is just a feeling, not a fact. I focus on what I can actually control, how I spend these last hours, how I treat the people I love, how I faced the natural process that all living things must go through. As the evening grew later and the lamps burned lower, the students began to understand that they were witnessing something remarkable. Their teacher was not just talking about courage in the face of death. He was actually demonstrating it. "Tomorrow," Epicurus said as the gathering began to end, "I may be too weak to speak much, but I want you to remember this night. I want you to remember that death held no terror for me, because I understood what it really was, and I want you to carry this understanding with you for the rest of your lives." As the students helped him back to his room, Epicurus felt a deep sense of peace. He had lived well, taught well, and now he would die well. His final lesson was almost complete. 3 days had passed since Epicurus died peacefully in his sleep, just as the morning sun began to rise over the garden. His students had found him with a gentle smile on his face, as if he had simply decided it was time to rest. Now they gathered in the main room where he had given his final teaching, trying to understand what their lives would be like without their beloved teacher. Hermarchus stood before the group holding a wooden box that contained dozens of scrolls. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Before he died, our teacher gave me these writings and asked me to share them with all of you. He also asked me to continue leading the garden according to the principles he taught us." Leontian wiped tears from her eyes, but managed to speak clearly. What did he write in those final letters? Hermarchus carefully unrolled one of the scrolls. He wrote instructions for how we should live together after his death. He wrote summaries of his most important teachings, so that new students can learn them easily. And he wrote letters to his friends in other cities, asking them to continue spreading his ideas. A young student named Alexander, who had only been in the garden for a few months, raised his hand. "Master Hermarchus, I am worried that without Epicurus here to guide us, we will forget his teachings or change them incorrectly." This was a fear that all of them shared. Hermarchus nodded thoughtfully. "Our teacher worried about this too. That is why he spent his last months writing down everything he considered most important. He called these writings his will and testament to the world." He held up another scroll. In this letter, he wrote detailed instructions about how the garden should be governed. He said that we should always make decisions together, with everyone having a voice. He said that we should continue to welcome people of all backgrounds. He said that we should never charge money for teaching, because wisdom should be available to everyone. Philippa, who had been so afraid during Epicurus's final lesson, spoke up. "But how can we teach others when we are still learning ourselves? I do not feel wise enough to share his ideas with strangers." "You do not need to be perfect to help someone else," Hermarchus replied gently. "Remember what our teacher always said? Philosophy is like medicine for the soul. If you know how to cure a headache, you can help someone who is suffering from a headache, even if you do not understand every detail of how the medicine works." Over the following weeks, word of Epicurus's death spread throughout Athens and beyond. To everyone's surprise, people began arriving at the garden asking to learn about his teachings. Some came because they had heard rumors about a philosophy that promised peace and happiness. Others came because they were curious about a school that treated women and slaves as equals. Theon, who had questioned the meaning of life during Epicurus's final teaching, found himself explaining the basic ideas to these newcomers. At first, he felt nervous and unsure, but gradually he discovered that teaching helped him understand the lessons more deeply. "The first thing you must know," he would tell each new group, "is that our teacher did not promise an easy life or magical solutions to every problem. He taught us how to find real contentment in the middle of a difficult world." Meanwhile, former students who had left the garden to return to their home cities began writing letters about their experiences. A merchant named Calotes, who had studied with Epicurus 10 years earlier, wrote from the island of Rhodes. "I use the master's teachings every day in my business. When customers are angry, or when my ships are delayed by storms, I remember that I can only control my own actions and reactions. This knowledge has made me both more successful and more peaceful." Another letter came from a woman named Themista, who had started her own small community in Corinth, based on Epicurean principles. "We have 12 families living together now," she wrote. "We share our meals, our work, and our children's education. The ideas that seem so unusual in Athens are helping us create a new way of life." But not everyone who heard about Epicurus's teachings understood them correctly. Some people in Athens began spreading rumors that the garden was a place of wild parties and immoral behavior. They claimed that Epicurus had taught people to seek only physical pleasure and ignore all moral rules. This worried the students greatly. Marcus came to Marcus with a troubled expression. "Master, people in the marketplace are saying terrible things about our teacher. They say he encouraged gluttony and laziness. They say we live like animals with no self-control." Marcus sighed. "Our teacher warned us that this would happen. People often hear only what they want to hear. When he spoke about pleasure, they thought he meant the kind of pleasure that comes from excess and indulgence. They did not listen carefully enough to understand that he meant the pleasure of a peaceful mind and a healthy body." "What should we do about these false stories?" Marcus asked. "We must continue living according to his true teachings," Marcus replied. "When people see how we actually behave with kindness, moderation, and wisdom, they will understand that the rumors are not true. Our lives must be the answer to their accusations." As the months passed, the influence of Epicurus's ideas began to spread in ways his students had never expected. A young Roman student named Lucretius, who had visited the garden briefly before Epicurus's death, returned to Rome with plans to write a long poem explaining Epicurean philosophy to Latin speakers. "Your teacher's ideas about atoms and natural law could change how Romans think about everything," Lucretius told Marcus during his farewell visit. "Most of my countrymen still believe that angry gods control their fate. If I can help them understand that the universe operates according to natural principles, they might finally stop living in constant fear." Another unexpected development came when several women who had studied in the garden began teaching other women in their own homes. Since most schools in the ancient world excluded women, these informal groups became the only way many intelligent women could access philosophical education. Metrodora, who had been one of Epicurus's most devoted students, started what she called evening conversations in her house near the Athens marketplace. "We read the master's letters together," she explained to Leontia during one of her visits back to the garden. "We discuss how to apply his teachings to the challenges we face as women in this society. Some of the participants have never read philosophy before, but they understand his ideas immediately, because he wrote so clearly and practically. Perhaps most importantly, the students began to understand that their teacher's death had not ended his influence, but had actually allowed it to spread more widely. While he was alive, his ideas were limited to the people who could visit the garden in person. Now that his teachings had been written down and his students were traveling throughout the Greek world, his wisdom could reach anyone who needed it." Marcus stood in the garden one evening, 6 months after Epicurus's death, and marveled at how much had changed. Letters arrived almost daily from former students and new followers. Visitors came from distant cities. Simple ideas that had once seemed so revolutionary were beginning to take root in communities across the Mediterranean world. "Teacher," he whispered to the empty air, "you were right. The good ideas do not die with the person who thinks them. They grow and spread like seeds on the wind, finding new soil wherever people are ready to live without fear." As he walked back toward the house where his fellow students were preparing the evening meal, Marcus felt both the sadness of loss and the excitement of new beginnings. Their beloved teacher was gone, but his gift to the world was just beginning to unfold. 200 years had passed since Epicurus died peacefully in his garden. The world had changed dramatically during those centuries. Rome had grown from a small Italian city into a vast empire that controlled most of the known world. Greek culture had spread far beyond Greece itself, and new ideas were mixing with old traditions in exciting ways. In the busy city of Rome, a young poet named Lucretius sat in his study, surrounded by scrolls and writing tablets. He had been working for months on an ambitious project, a long poem that would explain Epicurean philosophy to Roman readers. Many Romans had heard confused stories about Epicurus, but few understood what he actually taught. Lucretius dipped his pen in ink and began writing another verse. He wanted to capture the wonder and beauty of Epicurus's vision of the natural world. "All things that exist," he wrote, "are made of atoms moving through empty space. These tiny particles, too small for human eyes to see, combine and separate in endless patterns, creating everything from mountains to flowers to the thoughts in our minds." As he worked, Lucretius thought about how revolutionary this idea still was, even after 2 centuries. Most Romans believed that gods constantly interfered in human affairs, causing everything from thunderstorms to military victories. The idea that natural laws, not divine whims, governed the universe was still shocking to many people. But Lucretius had seen how this understanding could transform a person's life. His own father had spent his final years in terror, convinced that he would be punished after death for mistakes he had made as a young man. If only his father had known Epicurus's teachings about death, he might have found peace instead of torment. "Death is nothing to us," Lucretius wrote, echoing the master's famous words. "When we exist, death is not present. When death comes, we no longer exist. Death and life never meet, so death can never cause us pain." Meanwhile, in the great library of Alexandria, a scholar named Diogenes was carefully copying ancient manuscripts to preserve them for future generations. Among his most treasured possessions were original letters written by Epicurus himself. Many of the master's 300 books had been lost over the years, but these personal letters still conveyed his warm, practical wisdom. Diogenes often marveled at how clearly Epicurus wrote. Unlike other philosophers who used complicated language that only educated elites could understand, Epicurus had written as if he were talking to a friend. His explanations were so simple that a farmer or a shopkeeper could grasp them immediately. As Diogenes copied letter after letter, he noticed how often Epicurus had returned to the same basic themes. Be kind to your friends. Do not fear death or the gods. Find pleasure in simple things. These ideas seemed obvious when stated plainly, but Diogenes had learned that the most profound truths were often the simplest ones. Centuries continued to pass. The Roman Empire eventually fell, and Europe entered a period that later historians would call the Dark Ages. During these troubled times, many ancient texts were lost or forgotten. Christian monks preserved some Greek and Roman writings, but they had little interest in philosophers who denied divine punishment and eternal reward. For nearly 1,000 years, Epicurus's ideas survived mainly in scattered references and incomplete copies. A few scholars in the Islamic world read Arabic translations of his works. But in Christian Europe, his name was rarely mentioned except as an example of pagan wickedness. Then, in the 15th century, everything changed. European scholars began rediscovering ancient texts that had been preserved in monasteries and Islamic libraries. A manuscript hunter named Poggio Bracciolini found a complete copy of Lucretius's poem in a German monastery, where it had been sitting unread for centuries. When Poggio brought the manuscript back to Italy, it created a sensation among Renaissance thinkers. Here was a beautiful scientific explanation of the natural world that required no supernatural intervention. Here was a philosophy that celebrated human reason and the pursuit of happiness. Artists and writers began incorporating Epicurean ideas into their work. The painter Botticelli created images of Venus that captured the Epicurean ideal of natural beauty and pleasure. The philosopher Lorenzo Valla argued that Christian morality should embrace, rather than reject, earthly happiness. But it was during the Enlightenment of the 18th century that Epicurus's influence truly exploded. Thinkers like John Locke and David Hume found in his writings a rational approach to understanding human nature and society, and they appreciated his empirical method. The idea that knowledge comes from observing the world rather than accepting traditional authorities. In France, the philosopher Denis Diderot wrote enthusiastically about Epicurean materialism. In his famous encyclopedia, he explained how the atomic theory provided a scientific foundation for understanding everything from chemistry to psychology. If we are collections of particles following natural laws, he wrote, and we can study human behavior the same way we study the movement of planets or the growth of plants. The English philosopher John Stuart Mill found different insights in Epicurean ethics. Mill developed a theory called utilitarianism, which judged actions by whether they increased or decreased human happiness. Although Mill's system was more complex than Epicurus's original teachings, it shared the same basic goal: helping people live better, more satisfying lives. The greatest happiness for the greatest number, Mill wrote, echoing the ancient Greek master's concern for human well-being. This should be the guiding principle of all moral and political decisions. As the 19th century progressed, scientists began discovering evidence that supported Epicurus's ancient speculations about atoms. Chemists like John Dalton proved that matter really was composed of tiny, indivisible particles. Physicists like Ludwig Boltzmann showed how the behavior of gases could be explained by the random motion of countless molecules. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution provided another confirmation of Epicurean thinking. If humans had developed through natural processes rather than special creation, then Epicurus had been right to see people as part of the natural world rather than separate from it. In the 20th century, psychologists began studying happiness and well-being in ways that would have delighted Epicurus. Researchers discovered that people who valued simple pleasures, close relationships, and peace of mind were indeed happier than those who chased wealth, fame, or intense experiences. Dr. Martin Seligman, a pioneer in the field of positive psychology, wrote about what he called authentic happiness. His research confirmed many of Epicurus's insights about the difference between fleeting pleasures and lasting satisfaction. The good life, Seligman concluded, comes from using your strengths in service of something larger than yourself. While maintaining close relationships and finding meaning in simple daily experiences, even in the 21st century, as technology transformed every aspect of human life, Epicurus's basic insights remained relevant. In a world of constant stimulation and endless choices, his teachings about simplicity and mindfulness offered a path to sanity. Cognitive behavioral therapists used techniques that were remarkably similar to Epicurean philosophical exercises. When patients suffered from anxiety or depression, therapists taught them to examine their fears rationally, focus on what they could control, and find pleasure in small, everyday experiences. The old garden in Athens was long gone, but its spirit lived on in support groups, intentional communities, and friendship circles around the world, wherever people gathered to help each other live with less fear and more joy. The influence of the ancient philosopher could still be felt. As humanity entered an uncertain future facing challenges that Epicurus could never have imagined, his fundamental message remained as powerful as ever. Happiness is possible, fear is optional, and the secret of the good life lies. It's not in grand achievements, but in the simple art of being human. In a small apartment in modern New York City, Sarah Chen sat at her kitchen table, reading a book about ancient philosophy, while her morning coffee grew cold. She was a software engineer who had been struggling with anxiety and panic attacks for months. The constant pressure of deadlines, the overwhelming flood of news and social media, and the general uncertainty of life in the 21st century had left her feeling exhausted and afraid. Her therapist had recommended reading about Stoicism, but something about the rigid self-control and emotional suppression did not appeal to her. Then a friend had mentioned Epicurus, describing him as the ancient philosopher who figured out how to be happy. Sarah had been skeptical. What could someone who lived over 2,000 years ago possibly teach her about modern problems? But as she read, she found herself nodding in recognition. Here was someone who understood anxiety, who had lived through political chaos and social upheaval, who had watched friends and family suffer and die. Here was someone who had figured out how to find peace without ignoring the real difficulties of life. "The good is attainable," she read in one of his letters. "You do not need to be perfect or achieve great things to live well. You need only to understand what you truly require for happiness and to focus your energy on obtaining those simple necessities." Sarah thought about her own life. She had been chasing promotions, accumulating possessions, trying to build an impressive social media presence. But when had any of these things actually made her feel content? The moments of real joy in her life had been much simpler. Conversations with close friends, walks in the park, the satisfaction of solving a difficult programming problem, the taste of really good pizza after a long day. 3,000 miles away in Portland, Oregon, a group of 8 friends met every Sunday evening in someone's living room for what they called their Epicurean circle. They had started the group 2 years earlier when one of them, a philosophy professor named David, had been going through a difficult divorce and found comfort in reading about the ancient garden. "The thing that attracted me to Epicurus," David explained to newcomers, "was that he did not ask people to be saints or heroes. He just asked them to be thoughtful about what would actually make them happy." The group included a nurse, a carpenter, a retired teacher, a graphic designer, and several others. They came from different backgrounds and held different political views, but they shared a desire to live more intentionally and with less anxiety. "In our culture," said Maria the nurse, "we are constantly told that we need more money, more excitement, more achievements, more stuff. But when I started really paying attention to my own experience, I realized that the best parts of my life were already happening. They were just so simple that I had been ignoring them. Each week, The group would read a short passage from Epicurus or one of his followers, then discuss how the ideas applied to their current challenges. They had adapted some of his exercises for modern life. When someone was worried about something they could not control, the group would help them practice what they called the 3 questions. What exactly am I afraid will happen? How do I know this fear is realistic? What can I do right now to make my life better regardless of whether this feared thing happens? The discussions were not abstract or academic. Members talked about real problems, job stress, relationship difficulties, health concerns, financial worries. But instead of just complaining or seeking sympathy, they looked for practical ways to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary situations. Last week, shared Tom, the carpenter, I was getting really angry about a client who kept changing his mind about what he wanted. I was lying awake at night planning all the things I wanted to say to him. Then I remembered what we learned about the difference between what we can and cannot control. I realized I was wasting energy on something completely outside my power, his personality and decision-making process. So I decided to focus on what I could control, doing good work and communicating clearly about what the changes would cost. Halfway around the world, in a suburb of Tokyo, Dr. Kenji Tanaka was conducting research that would have fascinated Epicurus. As a psychologist specializing in anxiety disorders, Dr. Tanaka had noticed that many of his patients suffered from what he called catastrophic thinking, the tendency to imagine the worst possible outcomes and treat them as if they were certain to happen. Modern life bombards us with information about dangers and problems, Dr. Tanaka explained to his colleagues at a conference. Our brains, which evolved to help us survive in small tribal groups, are not equipped to process constant news about wars, diseases, climate change, and economic instability happening all over the world. He had developed a treatment approach that combined modern cognitive therapy with insights from ancient philosophy. His patients learned to distinguish between realistic concerns and imaginary fears, to focus on what they could actually influence, and to find pleasure and meaning in their immediate daily experiences. One of my patients, Dr. Tanaka shared, was a young mother who could not sleep because she was constantly worried about all the terrible things that might happen to her children. We worked together to help her see the difference between reasonable precautions and unlimited anxiety. She learned to ask herself, is this worry about something that is actually happening right now, or something that might possibly happen in the future? Can I do anything concrete about this concern today? If not, how can I return my attention to the present moment and the good things that are actually here? The woman had never heard of Epicurus, but she was practicing his fundamental insight that most of our suffering comes not from real present dangers, but from fears about imaginary future disasters. In hundreds of therapy offices, support groups, and self-help books around the world, people were rediscovering the practical wisdom that had first been articulated in a simple garden outside ancient Athens. They might not know the historical details or the philosophical terminology, but they were learning the same essential lessons. Happiness is possible, simplicity is powerful, friendship is precious, and fear is usually optional. The technology had changed dramatically since Epicurus's time, but human nature remained remarkably constant. People still struggled with anxiety about the future, grief about the past, confusion about what would truly make them happy, and loneliness in the midst of busy lives. And still, in quiet moments, in honest conversations, in small communities of care, his gentle wisdom continued to offer hope. You do not need to be perfect. You do not need to achieve great things. You do not need to understand the mysteries of the universe. You need only to be kind to your friends, grateful for simple pleasures, curious about the world around you, and brave enough to face life's inevitable challenges without adding unnecessary suffering. As Sarah finished her morning coffee and prepared to leave for work, she felt something she had not experienced in months, a sense of calm anticipation rather than anxious dread. She was still the same person with the same problems, but she was beginning to understand that she had been making her life much harder than it needed to be. The original garden was gone, its walls crumbled to dust, its olive trees long dead, but somewhere in the space between one human heart and another, in the moment when fear gives way to understanding, when isolation transforms into connection, when complexity yields to simplicity, the garden remained eternal. Epicurus had been right about death. When it came, he was no longer there to experience it. But he had been even more right about life. The atoms that had once composed his body and mind had indeed returned to the world, taking new forms, touching new lives, and continuing forever the work of helping human beings discover that happiness, like friendship, grows best when it is shared. In coffee shops and living rooms, in hospitals and schools, in therapy sessions and casual conversations, wherever people gathered to help each other live with less fear and more joy, the essential spirit of the garden lived on. And it always would, as long as humans needed, reminding that the secret of the good life was never really a secret at all, but a simple truth, hiding in plain sight, waiting patiently for anyone wise enough to see it.